This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today we're continuing with the Kamigawa Neon Dynasty Limited review. We took a look at all the multicolored and colorless cards yesterday, and today we'll be continuing with a look at every mono white card. Today is Saturday, and that's normally the day when my weekly Nitsa Notes video goes up. That's my weekly vlog series where I talk about limited magic. Unfortunately, there won't be an episode of that today, but in exchange, you get this set review video. Anyway, in these videos, I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on every card. If you aren't sure what the meaning of those grades are, you can find an explanation in the description. Keep in mind this video contains my thoughts about the cards in the format before actually playing with them. I will undoubtedly get some things wrong, but as the format evolves, I'll talk about those things on the channel. Also, keep in mind we're only talking about limited here, not any other formats. Alright, let's dive in with our first white card in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. First up, we have Ancestral Katana, which costs 1 generic and a white for a common artifact equipment. It says whenever a samurai or warrior you control attacks alone, you may pay 1 generic, and when you do, you attach the katana to it. The equipped creature gets +2/+1, and it has an equip cost of 3. This reminds me a little bit of Pirate's Cutlass, a card that really overperformed in its limited format. Now, this isn't colorless, and it doesn't equip for free, and it equipping at a discount is also more conditional, but I still think this will be a pretty nice common for the red-white deck especially, which is the Samurai Warrior one. If you're just equipping this the old-fashioned way, it won't be great, but if you have Warriors and Samurai around, the fact that this can just keep on moving on to your best attacker for only 1 mana is going to feel pretty good, and it doesn't hurt that it can be equipped the normal way in a pinch too. Plus, equipment have some additional upside in this format. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Ao, the Dawn Sky, who for 3 generic and 2 white is a 5/4 legendary dragon spirited mythic rare. It's got flying and vigilance, and when it dies, you choose one. You can look at the top 7 cards of your library, put any number of non-land permanent cards with total mana value 4 or less from among them onto the battlefield, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order, or you can put 2 +1/+1 counters on each permanent you control that's a creature or vehicle. This whole cycle is great, of course. Every card in it is a highly efficient flyer with a powerful death trigger. Basically, they are pick your poison type cards. If your opponent can't kill them, well, they probably win you the game by attacking. And if your opponent does kill one of these dragons, you get a choice between 2 powerful effects. Here, you get a 5 mana 5/4 with flying and vigilance. That would already be a B at least. Then when it dies, you have these great options. If your board isn't well developed, you'll probably go with putting some non-land permanents onto the battlefield, and if your board is well developed, you'll pump the whole thing. The latter is probably going to be the more powerful option most of the time, but the fact that you have an option even on an empty board is pretty great. This is an A+, a very easy bomb, one of the biggest ones in the format. Next up, it's Banishing Slash, which costs 2 white mana for an uncommon sorcery. It says destroy up to 1 target artifact, enchantment, or tapped creature. Then, if you control an artifact and an enchantment, create a 2/2 white samurai creature token with vigilance. This is a premium removal spell. This set has a ton of artifacts and enchantments that are also creatures, so even if those creatures aren't tapped, you can kill them with this. Plus, the additional flexibility of taking down other permanent types in addition to creatures is nice in general. The additional upside will give you a 2/2 sometimes too, especially in the black-white deck, which is the most interested in fulfilling these requirements. And when you do that, this is going to feel completely insane because you're paying 2 mana for a 2/2 that kills something effectively. It does cost double white, so it isn't splashable as some premium removal is, but it's still a pretty high pick. I'm giving it a B. Next up, we have Befriending the Moths, which for 3 generic and a white is a common saga. Chapter 1 and 2 say target creature you control gets +1/+1 and gains flying until end of turn. Chapter 3 says exile this saga, then return it to the battlefield transformed under your control. Every saga in this set does this. Once it hits Chapter 3, it turns into a creature. In this case, it becomes Imperial Moth, an enchantment creature insect that's a 2/4 flyer. So Chapter 1 and 2 here will very likely enable attacks you didn't have before, and that's a pretty big deal, especially because this eventually adds meaningfully to the board by giving you a 2/4 flyer. It will be a bit of a bummer to play this on a completely empty board, but that just won't happen that often. This looks like a good common to me, one you can first pick sometimes. I'm giving it a B-, and, based on what I've seen people say about these sagas in the comments of the first video in the set review and in various other places, I think many people are underrating them because they're thinking of them as too slow. It's definitely important to keep in mind that you don't get a creature for a few turns with most of them, but think of all the sagas we've had in the past that were good. Most of them don't give you a creature at all. You pay the mana on a single turn upfront, and the initial effect might not be amazing for that cost, but on the next turn you get that effect, and you still have all of your mana available, and then on the next turn you get a creature. I get why people feel like they might be too slow or whatever. If you just look at what you get initially and how long it takes you to get a creature, they seem pretty bad, but most of them give you a ton of value for the cost, and usually the first chapter and second chapter actually do things. If this format ends up being blistering fast, maybe they will end up too slow, but every color has so many of these that you have to imagine that in itself will slow the format down a bit. So yeah, most of these are playable or better, and in the case of Befriending the Moths, I think it's definitely better than simply playable, and one of the better white commons, as the B- grade shows. Next up, it's Blade Blizzard Kitsune, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/2 Fox Ninja at uncommon. It's got ninjutsu, and for 3 generic and a white, you can return an unblocked attacker you control to your hand to put the Kitsune onto the battlefield from your hand tapped and attacking, and it has double strike. So 3 mana for a 2/2 double striker is actually a great rate, and I kind of think that would be close to a B-. It's just a creature that can punch above its weight class really well, easily take down other cards that are 2 and 3 mana, and it hits hard, and it's both a good blocker and attacker. And on top of that, this set has plenty of auras, +1/+1 counters, and equipment, all of which go really well with double strike. The ninjutsu here is some nice additional upside, as sometimes maybe it'll let you sneak in 4 damage for lethal, or there's some other benefit to casting it that way, but I think you'll more frequently just cast this for 3 mana than ninjutsu it in, so I don't actually think the ninja angle here is massive upside. However, there is one weird thing you can do here. You can ninjutsu in the Kitsune to hit in first strike combat, and then you can ninjutsu in something else and return the Kitsune to your hand. That may not do something most of the time, but I can see it coming up on occasion. Anyway, I think this is a B. It's a great uncommon. Next up, we've got Born to Drive, which for 2 generic and a white is an uncommon enchantment aura. It says enchant artifact or creature. As long as enchanted permanent is a creature, it gets +1/+1 for each creature and or vehicle you control, and it comes with Channel. This is a returning ability in this set. You can pay a cost and discard a card with Channel to get some sort of effect. In this case, you pay 2 generic and a white and discard the card, and you get 2 1/1 colorless pilot creature tokens with. This creature crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. If this was just an aura, I would not be impressed. It's costly, dependent on your board state, and doesn't do anything to keep you from getting blown out by removal. I would likely give it a D if that's all it was. However, because the card has Channel, which effectively makes it into a pretty reasonably 3 mana spell that makes 2 1/1 tokens that are good at crewing vehicles, it's way better. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that you'll probably channel this more than you cast it as a spell. Still, once you have the channel mode, it's nice that you have this aura mode as a late game possibility, as, you know, this kind of aura can be a huge deal when you slap it on an efficient creature for a game-winning swing, but if that's really the only thing this type of card is doing, it's not very good. But because channel adds the additional mode, this is a pretty nice card. I think it's a C+. Next up, it is Brilliant Restoration, which costs 3 generic and 4 white mana. It's a rare sorcery, and it says return all artifact and enchantment cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. This is kind of hard to cast with quadruple white in the cost, but the effect does seem reasonably powerful in the late game, especially because the format has a ton of artifacts and enchantments, including mini creatures. So if you're reanimating like 3 permanents with this, it will usually feel pretty good, and if you're doing more than that, you're probably going to win the game. But we can't overlook how difficult it can be to cast something like this. Your typical limited deck is 2 colors, and there are plenty of games where you'll just never get the quadruple white you need. So the setup requirement, coupled with the mana requirement, really dings how effective this card can be. There is pretty good fixing in this format, and if you pick up enough dual lands that happen to produce white, it will become somewhat easier to cast this. You probably need like 12 sources, though, to feel confident about Brilliant Restoration being castable in your deck. It has a really high ceiling, one high enough that I'm interested in taking this early, but I don't think I want to give it like a straight up bomb grade just because of the challenges it presents to you in terms of, first, you need your graveyard stocked, and second, you also need to be able to produce this mana. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have Cloud Steel Kirin, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/2 artifact creature equipment Kirin at rare. It's got flying, and it says equipped creature has flying, and you can't lose the game, and your opponents can't win the game, and it has Reconfigure 5. This is a new mechanic in this set. There are a bunch of creatures in this set that are also equipment. This is one of them, and if you pay the Reconfigure cost here, which is 5 mana, you attach this to a creature you control. or unattach it from a creature. Reconfigure only as a sorcery, and while attached, this isn't a creature. So take away the whole equipment thing, and we have a 3-mana 3/2 with flying. That's a great rate in limited, and enough for a B- on its own. With Reconfigure in the mix, it's obviously even better, as it can lend flying to a different creature and give it the ability to keep you from losing or your opponent from winning. That's obviously a pretty powerful line of text, though keep in mind if your opponent ever kills the thing this is attached to or blows up the Kirin, it goes away, and if you're in a losing position, like at negative life, you'll lose on the spot. Still, the base level here is very good, and having that additional upside is enough for me to put this into the lower bomb range. Your opponent has to kill the thing you put this on in the late game, and in the early game, it's a great flyer. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Dragonfly Suit, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/2 artifact vehicle. At common, it's got flying and crew 1. This isn't the most amazing rate for a vehicle, but it is easy to crew and evasive, so there are going to be plenty of board states where it's getting through in the air. I think it's a C. Next up, we've got Aiganjo Exemplar, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/1 enchantment creature human samurai at common, and whenever a samurai or warrior you control attacks alone, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. This is a nice 2-drop. It counts itself, of course, so even without any other samurai around, it can attack as a 3/2. One really nice thing is that you can play this, and then on the same turn attack with another samurai or warrior, and +1/+1 is likely to help it attack more effectively. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Era of Enlightenment, which for 1 generic and a white is a common enchantment saga. Its Chapter 1 says Scry 2, Chapter 2 says you gain 2 life, and Chapter 3 says exile this saga, then return it to the battlefield transformed, and it comes back as Hand of Enlightenment, a 2/2 enchantment creature human monk with first strike. So, like most of these saga creatures, this one is slow at adding to the board, and unfortunately for this one, its Chapter 1 and 2 aren't exactly hugely impactful either. They're not really going to help you attack better, they're not going to help you block better. They're really just going to first improve the quality of your draws and gain you a little bit of life, and gaining that life can help make up for the amount of time you have to wait for this to come into play, but you are waiting a significant chunk of time. The good news is a 2/2 with first strike is pretty relevant all game long, just because first strike makes it a lot better of an attacker or blocker. And I mean, I think this card's perfectly fine, but the best versions of all of these sagas that we're going to see that turn into creatures, they do things that really change how your turn goes the turn they come down, even if it's just pumping a creature like we saw with Befriending the Moths or whatever. But this one doesn't really do that, and it being that slow is not great. The good news is Scry 2 is a nice thing to have in the late games. I mean, it's a fine card. It's kind of okay no matter when you play it. I think it's probably a C. Next up, we have the Fall of Lord Kondo, which costs 2 generic and a white for an uncommon enchantment saga. Chapter 1 says exile target creature an opponent controls with mana value 4 or greater. Chapter 2 says each player gains control of all permanents they own. And Chapter 3 says exile this saga, then return it to the battlefield transformed under your control. And it comes back as Fragment of Kondo, a 1/3 human noble enchantment creature with Defender, and when it dies, you draw a card. So when you have a target for Chapter 1 with this is going to feel really good. Unfortunately, Chapter 2 is almost entirely meaningless, so the other 2 chapters really need to carry their weight. But yeah, if you hit something with Chapter 1 and then get Fragment of Kondo 2 turns later, you'll feel like you're doing a pretty good job, as you end up with 2 cards worth of value. However, when you can't hit a thing with Chapter 1, there's almost no reason to cast this, and that certainly hurts. This format does have lots of ways to modify creatures, so 4 power will probably show up reasonably often, but probably still not often enough for this to quite do the job consistently enough to be anything higher than a C+. If you get a hit with Chapter 1, it's going to feel like a B. If you don't, it's going to feel like a D or worse, so that's a pretty big chasm. Next up, it's Farewell, which for 4 generic and 2 white is a rare sorcery, and it says choose 1 or more, exile all artifacts, exile all creatures, exile all enchantments, and exile all graveyards. This looks really good. A sweeper that just always blows everything up is generally a bit awkward and limited because there's so many situations where it doesn't really work out for you. Awkward or not, though, wrath effects do reshape the board in a way basically nothing else can, and this comes with the added upside of being a bit more customizable. Like, if your opponent's creatures happen to mostly be enchantments and artifacts, and you don't lose nearly as much by naming those, you can name those 2 for a much better effect than you would get if you just wiped the whole board. And there are lots of different choices you can make with it that allow you to come out ahead more than you would with a normal wrath effect. And in a situation where what you need is still a complete reset button, well, it does that too. I think this is a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Goshintai of Shared Purpose, which for 3 generic and a white is a 1/3 legendary enchantment creature shrine at uncommon. It's got vigilance, and it says at the beginning of your instep, you may pay 1 generic. If you do, create a 1/1 colorless spirit creature token for each shrine you control. I like that the shrines this time around are creatures, as it's a lot easier to get value out of them, and that's definitely the case here. A 4 mana 1/3 with vigilance that lets you pay 1 to make a 1/1 during your instep every turn is a card that I would always be pretty happy with in Limited. Sure, the stat line's not impressive, but cranking out a 1/1 every now and then is pretty nice. If you combine this with some of the other shrines, it's going to get silly. It is probably ideal to wait to play this until you can use its ability in the same turn. That way you got something that added to the board either way. The stat line does hold it back some, but I think this might be something you take with a pretty high pick. Doesn't even matter if you have other shrines. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Golden Tail Disciple, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/3 enchantment creature fox monk at common, and it's got lifelink. So this is an enchantment, which means it's good for decks interested in that, and the fact that it has lifelink means it's a good creature to modify with equipment or counters. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Hotshot Mechanic, which for 1 white mana is a 2/1 artifact creature fox pilot at uncommon, and it can crew vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. So this is pretty sweet. You know, a 1 mana 2/1 isn't that great in Limited. Most of the time it gets outclassed pretty quickly, and other 1 mana cards can just trade for it. But this one has stuff going on that makes it a pretty interesting 1 mana 2/1. If you play this on turn 1 and can get in with it, it's going to feel good, but the vehicle upside here is pretty real. It can crew almost every single vehicle in this format, all on its own as a 1 mana card, and there are a ton of vehicles. We saw some in yesterday's video where we looked at all the artifacts, colorless artifacts, and we're going to see more throughout the week, including more in this video. I guess we've already seen some now that I think about it. So the fact is, this is a 1 mana 2/1 that can come down early, maybe do a little bit of damage, and then in the later part of the game, it can just crew all of your stuff. And you're going to have vehicles in white, so that's actually a pretty impressive thing to have. It's also, an artifact, which has some extra value. Overall, this is a pretty nice little card. I'm giving it a C+. It's definitely a card I could see going up, like the ability to crew basically all the vehicles, maybe even better than I'm thinking it is, but for now I'm starting it at a C+. Next up, we've got Imperial Oath, which for 5 generic and a white is a common sorcery, and you create 3 2/2 white samurai creature tokens with vigilance and scry 3. I don't love this. 6 mana is a lot, and you need to be getting something that's pretty impressive, and I don't think 3 bodies and scry 3 is exactly that. The 3 bodies can help, but there are also plenty of board states where it doesn't help that much. Like if what you're dealing with are evasive creatures and things like that, it just isn't going to do anything. I just want more for 6 mana, generally speaking. I think it's probably a C-. Next up, we have Imperial Recovery Unit, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/4 artifact vehicle at uncommon. And when it attacks, you return target creature or vehicle card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to your hand, and it has crew 2. This looks pretty nice in terms of cost and what it takes to crew. It isn't the most efficient vehicle ever, but it has the ability to return cards to your hand, and there are enough relevant 1 and 2 drops around that you'll pull this off sometimes, and even just doing it once is going to feel great, giving this a C+. Next up, we've got Imperial Subduer, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/2 human samurai at common, and whenever a samurai or warrior you control attacks alone, tap target creature you don't control. Tapping an opposing creature tends to be a pretty nice effect for aggro decks in Limited, as it can often enable attacks you just didn't have otherwise. This does have an additional restriction in that your warrior or samurai has to attack alone to do it, meaning you can't really open up the floodgates, but it still seems pretty nice. The Subduer itself is a warrior, so it triggers its own ability. Or samurai, rather. The samurai warrior deck in general has a bunch of payoffs for attacking with 1 creature at a time too, so I think this is a pretty good common. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, we have Intercessor's Arrest, which for 2 generic and a white is a common enchantment aura with enchant permanent. Enchanted permanent can't attack, block, or crew vehicles. Its activated abilities can't be activated unless they're mana abilities. This is premium removal. The fact it shuts down blocking, attacking, crewing, and activated abilities is great. This format does have more ways to blow up enchantments than normal, but it also has more payoffs for enchantments than normal, so it's probably kind of a wash. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, we've got Invoke Justice, which costs 1 generic and 4 white. It's a rare sorcery, and it says return target permanent card from your graveyard to the battlefield, then distribute 4 +1/+1 counters among any number of creatures and or vehicles target player controls. So there's a whole Invoke cycle of cards that have quadruple mana of the same color, and they're all pretty powerful, but as we've already talked about with another quadruple white mana card, not that easy to cast. There are common gain lands in this format that will make it a little easier for you to end up with enough white sources to make use of something like this, but when giving a grade to a card like this, we do have to take into account some of the challenges of your draft needing to go the right way, and even if it does go the right way, sometimes you just won't be able to cast this. The good news is, you don't need quadruple white mana early for this. It'll be greater in the late game anyway. And 5 mana to reanimate a permanent and get 4 +1/+1 counters is pretty insane. If this was easy to cast, it would be an A. I think we have to sort of knock it down to a B because of how challenging it will be to cast, but you should still value it pretty highly and try to get your hands on like 11 to 12 white sources to make it work. Next up, we've got Kitsune Ace, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 Fox Pilot at common, and whenever a vehicle you control attacks, you choose one. That vehicle gains first strike until end of turn, or untap Kitsune Ace. I like that this gives you vehicle payoffs, even if it isn't the card that's doing the crewing. Letting first strike makes a lot of vehicles hard to block. You can also untap it with its ability. That is useful in a situation where you have used the Kitsune Ace to crew the thing, because then you can untap it and still have it as a blocker. So, this is a nice bear with a bunch of upside. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Kyodai, Soul of Kamigawa, which for 3 generic and a white is a 3/3 legendary dragon spirit at rare. It's got flash and flying, and when it enters the battlefield, another target permanent gains indestructible for as long as you control Kyodai, and you can pay 1 of each color of mana to give it +5/+5 until end of turn. So, even if you don't have the capability of paying for the 5 color ability, and you probably won't be able to, Kyodai is still very good. A 4 mana 3/3 with flying and flash is already like a B. Those stats are good and allow you to ambush plenty of creatures. The fact it also grants indestructibility to something else is pretty awesome and could really allow you to generate some serious blowouts that will ultimately result in like a 3-for-1. You can, of course, also use it to protect a permanent from removal. You may not always be able to take full advantage of the enter the battlefield ability, but when you can, it's going to be awesome. I think this is a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, we've got Light the Way, which for 1 white mana is a common instant. It says choose one, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature or vehicle, untap it, or return target permanent you control to its owner's hand. We see these cheap cards with 2 situational modal effects all the time, and they almost always end up disappointing. It seems like you'll be able to do something meaningful with one of these modes, but it just doesn't go that way. When you can use it as a trick to help your creature win combat, or help a creature dodge removal, or you rebuy an Enter the Battlefield ability, it'll feel good, and that sounds like a lot of things, and it kind of is, but those situations just don't present themselves often enough for this to actually give you a card's worth of value. I'm giving this a D+. Next up, it is Light Paws, Emperor's Voice, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 legendary Fox Advisor at rare, and whenever an aura enters the battlefield under your control, if you cast it, you may search your library for an aura card with mana value less than or equal to that aura, and with a different name than each aura you control, put that card onto the battlefield attached to Light Paws, Emperor's Voice, and then shuffle. So, this is a 2 mana 2/2 that comes with some nice upside, as searching up auras and putting them on him for free is pretty sweet. Now, the aura does have to have the right mana value and the right name for it to work out, and that won't always be automatic, but it probably also won't be that hard to set things up that way. I think this has enough upside that I want to give it a B-. Next up, it's Lion Sash, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/1 artifact creature equipment cat at rare. You can pay 1 white mana and exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a permanent card, put a +1/+1 counter on Lion Sash. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each +1/+1 counter on Lion Sash, and it has reconfigure for 2. This looks really good. It's very reminiscent of Scavenging Ooze, and that's great company to keep. You won't always have stuff to exile with it early, and it will definitely do more work in the mid to late game, but in those situations, it's going to take over the game, especially because you have the ability to move it around to other creatures. I think this is a bomb. It'll grow throughout the game and be a significant problem whether it's a creature or an equipment. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Lucky Offering, which for 1 white mana is a common sorcery, and it says destroy target artifact with mana value 3 or less, you gain 3 life. This is actually passable in your main deck in this format since there's so many artifacts, and many of them can be blown up by this. It is still narrow enough that I don't love putting it in the main deck. It's probably a C- there. It's going to be a little better out of your sideboard. Next up, we've got March of Otherworldly Light, which costs X and a white, and it's a rare instant, and it says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, you may exile any number of white cards from your hand. This spell costs 2 less to cast for each card exiled this way. Exile target artifact, creature, or enchantment with mana value X or less. This is premium removal. It won't usually be super efficient, as you'll almost always be paying 1 more mana than your opponent did for what you exile, but it makes up for that by being able to deal with 3 permanent types, permanently getting rid of the thing you remove, and being an instant. In a pinch, you can even exile some cards in your hand to take something down that's really big. That sort of effect isn't quite as exciting in Limited as in Constructed, as 2-for-1ing yourself is not normally the best idea in Limited. You'd rather just pay more mana most of the time. But if you find yourself in a situation where you have to do it, it's nice that the option is there. I think this is a B. Next up, it is Michiko's Reign of Truth, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon saga. Chapter 1 says, target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each artifact and or enchantment you control. That's what Chapter 2 says too. And Chapter 3 says, exile this saga, then return it to the battlefield transformed. And it comes back as Portrait of Michiko, who is a 0/0 enchantment creature human noble, and she gets +1/+1 for each artifact and or enchantment you control. I think this looks pretty good. There are enough artifacts and enchantments around that Chapter 1 and 2 are likely to provide significant buffs. Since it counts itself, it will at least give something +1/+1, and that's not too shabby, though not great either. It will also be able to do a lot more than that. Once it becomes a creature, it might struggle to be large, but probably not, as there are enough artifacts and enchantments that her being like a 2/2 is a pretty likely outcome. It just requires 1 other artifact or enchantment, and she can grow throughout the game. I think this is a B-. Next up, we've got Moth Rider Patrol, which for 1 white mana is a 1/1 Fox Warrior at common. It's got flying. You can pay 3 generic and a white and tap it to tap target creature. So this has a couple of nice synergy things going on. First, it's a warrior with flying, so it frequently will be able to attack alone and trigger the effects that do things for samurai or warriors. Secondly, the fact it has flying means it pairs nicely with ninjutsu, and yeah, white has only 1 ninja, but you're not going to be playing mono white, so it could come up. Those things definitely help the card, and it's nice that it's decent early game attacker and then can master decoy things up in the late game. The cost of 4 for that effect is pretty steep and makes it a lot less impressive than it is if it costs 2 or even 3 mana, but it is a nice effect to have around in the late game. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Norika Yamazaki, the Poet, who for 2 generic and a white is a 3/2 legendary human samurai at uncommon. She's got Vigilance, and whenever a samurai or warrior you control attacks alone, you can cast target enchantment card from your graveyard this turn. A 3-mana 3/2 with Vigilance is usually a reasonable playable, and this one comes with a very nice ability. You won't always have an enchantment in your graveyard, of course, but there are a lot of enchantments in this set that you'll have them reasonably often. And obviously, casting one of them off of this ability is effectively drawing a card, and that's pretty darn powerful. Like with all of these, it's great that they design them so they can trigger the ability on their own, but you can also use other samurai or warriors to trigger the ability if you've got them around. I think this is strong enough to first pick in some weaker packs, giving it a B-. Next up, we've got Regent's Authority, which for 1 white mana is a common instant, and it says target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. If it's an enchantment creature or legendary creature, instead put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. This is a solid trick. 1 mana for +2/+2 tends to be a decent rate, and the additional enchantment legendary creature upside is something you'll be able to take advantage of often enough. I'm giving it a C. It'll be nice in white aggressive decks. Next up, we've got Repel the Vile, which for 3 generic and a white is a common instant, and it says choose one. Exile target creature with power 4 or greater, or exile target enchantment. This is much better in this format than it would be in your typical one. As I've said numerous times already, there's lots of enchantments around, and that mode might actually be the one that comes up more often than the ability to take down a creature with high power. But it'll be able to do one of those things often enough that it's a pretty nice card. It isn't quite a premium removal spell given the restrictions and the cost, but it seems pretty nice for a common. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's the Restoration of Aiganjo, which for 2 generic and a white is a rare enchantment saga. Chapter 1 says search your library for basic planes, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. Chapter 2 says you may discard a card. When you do, return target permanent card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. And Chapter 3 says exile this saga, then return it to the battlefield transformed under your control, and it comes back as Architect of Restoration, an enchantment creature Fox Monk that's a 3/4 with Vigilance. And when it attacks or blocks, you make a 1/1 colorless spirit creature token. So Chapter 1 on this is kind of underwhelming. I mean, I like that it makes sure you hit a land drop. Making sure you draw planes on turn 3 is sometimes a nice thing to do, but it's also not an effect that has any real impact on the board at all in the immediate future. The good news is Chapter 2 is likely to add to the board a little bit, though the fact it brings the thing back tapped is a little annoying. It is kind of cool. You can just discard a thing that costs 2 or less and then reanimate it. It might help you play that thing and then play another spell during that turn. It also may not do anything, so there's times where Chapter 2 also won't do very much. The good news is, the creature that it becomes, the Architect of Restoration, has enough going on that it's pretty relevant all game long. You'll usually at least be able to trade it for something and get a 1/1, and sometimes it'll be able to take over the game. So, yeah, this is kind of slow. Chapters 1 and 2 aren't nearly as impactful as I'd like them to be, but I do think they give you some nice value. I mean, you're drawing a planes, which is nice, and sometimes you'll reanimate a thing. Again, I kind of wish like a +1/+1 counter was in there somewhere. Something like that would be a little more meaningful, but I still think this is pretty good. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Selfless Samurai, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 Fox Samurai at uncommon. And whenever a samurai or warrior you control attacks alone, it gains lifelink. And you can sacrifice Selfless Samurai, and another target creature you control gains indestructible until end of turn. So this is a really good uncommon. A 2-mana 2/2 with lifelink would be a solid card, and that's basically what it is. It's not a lifelinker when it blocks, but you know what I mean. A 2-mana 2/2 that can sacrifice itself to make something indestructible would also be a nice card, and this does both of those things. Plus, in most ways, it's better than just being a 2-mana 2/2 with lifelink, since it can let larger creatures attack on their own and gain the useful keyword. The whole package here is great. This has solid stats and 2 nice abilities. I think you can first pick this pretty happily. I'm giving it a B. Next up, we've got Seven Tail Mentor, which for 3 generic and a white is a 2/3 Fox Samurai at common. When it enters the battlefield or dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature or vehicle you control. This is a nice common. It'll immediately add a counter to the board, which can really alter the way your turn goes, and you get another counter out of it when it dies. Sure, it would be nice if it was like that card from a few sets back that costs the same amount of mana and let you put 2 counters on things, but I still think this is a quality card. Having a useful creature type and also modifying creatures obviously gets some extra points too, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Sky Blessed Samurai, which for 6 generic and a white is a 4/4 enchantment creature human samurai at uncommon, and it costs 1 less to cast for each enchantment you control, and it has flying. Almost no matter what white deck you're in, casting this for 5 is a reasonable expectation, and that is quite the efficient flyer. Sometimes it'll be even more efficient than that, and of course sometimes it'll cost more, but I think it will be more likely that it costs 5 than anything else. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Spirited Companion, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/1 enchantment creature dog at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. So, white got an Elvish Visionary, and that's always a pretty decent card in Limited, as adding something to the board and getting a card out of it feels pretty good. Combines with ninjutsu to some extent, it combines with enchantment synergies. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Sunblade Samurai, which for 4 generic and a white is a 4/4 enchantment creature human samurai at common, and it has channel. You can pay 2 and discard it to search your library for a basic plains card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle, and you gain 2 life. This is a nice common. If you have 5 mana, you can cast it as an okay body with vigilance, and if you're having problems finding mana in the early part of the game, you can channel this away to find another land, and it even gains you some life. It isn't that far from being a 5 mana 4/4 with vigilance that has cycling for 2 mana. Flexibility like this really trumps the fact that neither half of this card would be amazing on its own. I'm giving this a C+, albeit a C+ that is about as close to a B- as you can get. Next up, it's Touch the Spirit Realm, which for 2 generic and a white is an uncommon enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile up to 1 target artifact or creature until it leaves the battlefield, and you can channel it, pay 1 generic and a white, and discard it to exile target artifact or creature, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So this is the uncommon premium removal that white often gets. It's an Oblivion Ring effect, and those are always nice. They do the job efficiently, and they're reasonably flexible. The fact that your opponent can get the thing back is a bit of a bummer, of course, but that downside is well worth it. You'll probably not channel this really often, but keep in mind you can use it not only to rebuy your own Enter the Battlefield abilities, but if you only have 2 mana and not 3 mana and you need to get a blocker out of the way to win the game, you can channel this to do that because the creature will be gone, even if it's your opponent's, until the next end step. So you could find an opening with it sometimes, even though most of the time just straight up casting it is more valuable. The channel part is just upside. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Wanderer's Intervention, which for 1 generic and a white is a common instant, and it deals 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. This is restrictive about what it can kill, both because of the 4 damage and the attacking or blocking thing, but it will often feel reasonably efficient. I don't quite consider things like this premium because of their restrictiveness, but I do think you end up playing the first copy of this in a lot of your white decks. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's the Wandering Emperor, which for 2 generic and 2 white is a legendary planeswalker. She has 3 loyalty, she's a mythic rare, she's got flash, and as long as she's entered the battlefield this turn, you can activate her loyalty abilities anytime you could cast an instant. She has a +1 that says put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature. It gains first strike until end of turn. A -1 that says create a 2/2 white samurai creature token with vigilance. And a -2 that says exile target tapped creature and you gain 2 life. So we finally know who the Wanderer is after first seeing her in War of the Spark. This time around, she packs a lot more power, which makes sense. She's a mythic rare this time, and she was uncommon last time. The fact she has flash is amazing, especially because her +1 is the kind of thing that will make a lot of creatures just wreck another creature in combat. A stats boost plus first strike has a tendency to do that. You can basically use her as a combat trick on your turn, or use her on your opponent's turn. You can, of course, also use her other 2 abilities immediately at instant speed that first turn, which is amazing. You can kill an attacker, or make a 2/2 to block a 1/1 or something. So yeah, this is an incredible bomb. If you flash this in at the end of your opponent's turn and use 1 ability, and then you get to have your turn, and then you use another ability, I mean, you're going to be getting a ton of value out of her almost immediately. She doesn't really have a game-breaking ultimate, but she doesn't really need one. You know, her abilities are good. The flash will usually let you have her already trade for a card, and then things are just going to snowball from there. She's an absolute bomb. I'm giving her an A+. And our last white card is When We Were Young, which for 3 generic and a white is an uncommon instant. It says up to 2 target creatures each get +2/+2 until end of turn. If you control an artifact and an enchantment, those creatures also gain lifelink until end of turn. So this trick has the potential to create some 2-for-1 blowouts, but it's also pretty expensive. And we've seen similar tricks that always grant keywords like lifelink not be that impressive when they're pumping 2 things for a bunch of mana. I think running one of these in your aggressive white decks with a decent number of artifacts and enchantments, it's probably something you do, but I can still see it getting cut a decent percentage of the time, giving it a C-. Well, those are my thoughts on all the white cards in the set. Tomorrow I'll be back with a look at all the blue cards. If you disagree about anything I had to say in this video, let me know in the comments. If you want to stay aware of when new set review videos come out, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to make sure you are caught up on this set review, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.